Hey everyone, this is a piece by Bookchin. It's titled The Revolutionary Politics of Libertarian Municipalism. Libertarian municipalism is a revolutionary politics and not a new version of Paul Bruce's reformist, quote, possibilism of the 1890s. Wikipedia says Paul Bruce was a French socialist leader of the Possibiliste group and active in the Euro-Federation anti-authoritarian section of the International Working Men's Association. Back to the text. Libertarian municipalism is in no way compromises with parliamentarism, reformist attempts to, quote, improve, end quote, capitalism, or the perpetuation of private property. Limited exclusively to the municipality as the locus for political activity, as distinguished from provincial and state governments, not to speak of national and supranational governments, libertarian municipalism is revolutionary to the core, in the very important sense that it seeks to exacerbate the latent and often very real tension between the municipality and the state, and to enlarge the democratic institutions of the commune that still remain, at the expense of statist institutions. It counterposes the confederation to the nation-state and libertarian communism to existing systems of private and nationalized property. Libertarian municipalism is an explicit attempt to update the traditional anarchist communist ideal of the federation of communes, or, quote, commune of communes, end quote. More specifically, it aims for the federal linking of libertarian communist municipalities in the form of directly democratic popular assemblies, as well as the collective control or, quote, ownership of socially important property. Where anarchist communists in the past have regarded the federation of communes as an ideal to be achieved after an insurrection, libertarian municipalists, I contend, regard the federation or confederation of communes as a political practice that can be developed, at least partly, prior to an outright revolutionary confrontation with the state, a confrontation which, in my view, cannot be avoided and, if anything, should be encouraged by increasing the tensions between the state and confederations of municipalities. In fact, libertarian municipalism is a communalist practice for creating a revolutionary culture, and for bringing revolutionary change into complete conformity with our social goals. In the last case, it unifies practice and ideal into a single and coherent means and ends approach for initiating a libertarian communist society, without any disjunction between the strategy for achieving such a society and the society itself. At no point should libertarian municipalists cultivate the illusion that the state and bourgeois will allow such a continuum to find fulfillment without open struggle. New section, the revolutionary municipality. It would be helpful to place libertarian municipalism in a broad historical perspective, all the more to understand its revolutionary character in human affairs generally, as well as its place in the repertoire of anti-statist practices. The town or city, or more broadly, the municipality, is not merely a, quote, space created by a given density of human habitations. In terms of its history as a civilizing tendency in humanity's development, the municipality is integrally part of the sweeping process whereby human beings began to dissolve biologically conditioned social relations based on real or fictitious blood ties with their primordial hostility to, quote, strangers, and slowly replaced them by largely social and rational institutions, rights and duties that increasingly encompassed all residents of an urban space, irrespective of consanguinity and biological facts. The town, city, municipality, or commune, the equivalent word in Latin countries for, quote, municipality, end quote, was the emerging civic substitute based on residence and social interests for the tribal blood group, which had been based on myths of a common ancestry. The municipality, however slowly and incompletely, formed the necessary condition for human association based on rational discourse, material interest, and a secular culture irrespective of and often in conflict with ancestral roots and blood ties. Indeed, the fact that people can come together peacefully and share creatively in the exchange of ideas without hostility or suspicion today, despite our disparate ethnic, linguistic, and national backgrounds, is a grand historic achievement of civilization, one that is the work of centuries involving a painful discarding of primordial definitions of ancestry and the replacement of these archaic definitions by reason, knowledge, and a growing sense of our status as members of a common humanity. In great part, this humanizing development was the work of the municipality, the increasingly free space in which people, as people, began to see each other realistically, steadily, unfettered by archaic notions of biological consanguinity, tribal affiliation, and a mystical, tradition-laden, and parochial identity. I do not contend that this process of civilization has been completely achieved. Far from being completely achieved. The process of civilization is far from being completely achieved. Without the existence of a rational society, the municipality can easily become a megalopolis, in which community, however secular, is replaced by atomization and an inhuman social scale beyond the comprehension of its citizens, indeed, becomes the space for class, racial, religious, and other irrational conflicts. But both historically and contemporaneously, cityfication forms the necessary condition, albeit by no means fully actualized, for the realization of humanity's potentiality to become fully human, rational, and collectivistic, thereby shedding divisive, essentially animalistic divisions based on presumed blood affiliations and differences, mindless custom, fearful imaginaries, and a non-rational, often intuitional notion of rights and duties. Hence, the municipality is the potential arena for realizing the great goal of transforming parochialized human beings into truly universal human beings, a genuine humanitas, divested of the darker animalistic attributes of the primordial world. The rational municipality in which all human beings can be citizens, irrespective of their ethnic background and ideological convictions, constitutes the true arena of a communalist society. Metaphorically speaking, it is not only a desideratum for rational human beings, without which a free society is impossible, it is also the future of a rational humanity, the indispensable space for actualizing humanity's potentialities for freedom and self-consciousness. I do not presume to claim that a confederation of libertarian municipalities, a commune of communes, has ever existed in the past. Yet no matter how frequently I disclaim the existence of any historical, quote, models and, quote, paradigms for libertarian municipalities, my critics still try to saddle me with the many social defects of Athens, revolutionary New England towns, and the like, as if they were somehow an integral part of my, quote, ideals. This criticism is cynical demagogy and beneath contempt. I privilege no single city or group of cities, be they classical Athens, the free cities of the medieval world, the town meetings of the American Revolution, the sections of the Great French Revolution, or the anarcho-syndicalist collectives that emerged in the Spanish Revolution, as the full actualization, still less the comprehensive, quote, models, or, quote, paradigms of the libertarian municipalist vision. Yet significant features, despite various, often unavoidable distortions, existed among all these municipalities and the federations that these municipalities formed. These municipalities' value for us lies in the fact that we can learn from all of these municipalities about the ways in which these municipalities practice the democratic precepts by which these municipalities were guided, and we can incorporate the best of the municipalities' institutions for our own and future times, study their defects, and gain inspiration from the fact that these municipalities did exist and functioned with varying degrees of success for generations, if not centuries. At present, I think it is important to recognize that when we advance a politics of libertarian municipalism, we are not engaged in discussing a mere tactic or strategy for creating a public sphere. Rather, we are trying to create a new political culture that is not only consistent with our communalist goals, but that include real efforts to actualize these goals, fully cognizant of all the difficulties that face us and the revolutionary implications that hold for us in in the years ahead. Let me note here that the, quote, neighborhood, end quote, is not merely the place where people make their homes, rear their children, and purchase many of their goods. Under a more political coloration, so to speak, a neighborhood may well include those vital spaces where people congregate to discuss political as well as social issues. Indeed, is the extent to which public issues are openly discussed in a city or town that truly defines the neighborhood as an important political and power space. By this I do not mean only an assembly where citizens discuss and gird themselves to fight for specific policies. I also mean the neighborhood as the center of a town, where citizens may gather as a large group to share their views and give public expression to their policies. This was the function of the Athenian agora, for example, and the town squares in the Middle Ages. The spaces for political life may be multiple, but they are generally highly specific and definable, not random or ad hoc. Such essentially political neighborhoods have often appeared in times of unrest, when sizable numbers of individuals spontaneously occupy spaces for discussion, as in the Hellenic Agora. I recall them during my own youth in New York City, in Union Square and Crotona Park, where hundreds and possibly thousands of men and women appeared weekly to informally discuss the issues of the day. Hyde Park in London constituted such a civic space, as did the Palais Royal in Paris, which was the breeding ground of the Great French Revolution and the Revolution of 1830. And during the early days of the 1848 Revolution in Paris, scores, possibly hundreds, of neighborhood assembly halls existed as clubs and forums and potentially formed the basis for a restoration of the older neighborhood sections of 1793. The best estimates indicate that club membership did not exceed 70,000 out of a total population of about 1 million residents. Yet had this club movement been coordinated by an active and politically coherent revolutionary organization, it could have become a formidable, possibly a successful force during the weeks of crisis that led to the June insurrection of the Parisian workers. There is no reason in principle why such spaces and the people who regularly occupy those spaces cannot become citizens' assemblies as well. Indeed, like certain sections in the Great French Revolution, they may well take a leading role in sparking a revolution and pushing that revolution forward to that revolution's logical conclusion. New section, Recreating a Public Sphere. Libertarian municipalism seeks to go beyond the problems and limitations in classical anarchist communist theory. Above all, by insisting that a political sphere, distinguishable from the state and potentially libertarian in its possibilities, must be acknowledged, and its potentialities for a truly libertarian politics must be explored. We cannot simply content ourselves with simplistically dividing civilization into a workaday world of everyday life that is properly social, as I call it, in which we reproduce the conditions of our individual existence at work, in the home, and among our friends, and the world of the state, which reduces us at best to docile observers of the activities of the professionals who administer our civic and national affairs. Between these two worlds is still another world, the realm of the political, where our ancestors in the past, at various times and places historically, exercised varying degrees of control over the commune and the confederation to which that commune belonged. It has always been a lacuna in anarchist communist theory that the political was conflated with the state, thereby effacing a major distinction between a political sphere in which people in varying degrees exercised power, often through direct assemblies over their civic environment, and the state, in which people had no direct control, often no control at all over that environment. If politics is denatured to mean little more than statecraft and the manipulation of people by people's so-called, quote, representatives, then a condition that has acquired varying forms of expression in the classical Athenian assembly, popular medieval civic assemblies, town meetings, and the revolutionary sectional assemblies of Paris, is conveniently erased. And the multitudinous instructions for managing a municipality become reducible to the behavior of cynical parliamentarians, or worse. Yet, It is a gross simplification of historical development and the world in which we live to see the political simply as the practice of statecraft. Just as the tribe emerged long before the city, so the city emerged long before the state, indeed, often in opposition to the state. Mesopotamian cities, appearing in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers some 6,000 years ago, are believed to have been managed by popular assemblies long before they were forced by intercity conflicts to establish state-like institutions and ultimately despotic imperial institutions. It was in these early cities that politics, that is, popular ways of managing the city, were born and may very well have thrived. The state followed later and elaborated itself institutionally, often in bitter opposition to tendencies that tried to restore popular control over civic affairs. Nor can we afford to ignore the fact that the same conflict also emerged in early Athens and probably other Greek polis. Long before, I don't know if I'm saying that, polis, Poleis, long before the development of the state reached a relatively high degree of completion. One can see the recurrence of similar conflicts in the struggle of the Gracchi brothers and popular assemblies in Rome against the elitist Senate, and, repeatedly, in the medieval cities, long before the rise of the late medieval aristocracies and the Baroque monarchies of the 15th and 16th centuries. Wikipedia says the Gracchi brothers were two brothers who lived during the beginning of the late Roman Republic, Tiberius Gracchus and Gaius Gracchus. The Gracchi brothers served in the plebeian tribunates of 133 BC and 122 to 121 BC, respectively. The Gracchi brothers have been received as well-born and eloquent advocates for social reform who were both killed by a reactionary political system. The Gracchi brothers' terms in the tribunate precipitated a series of domestic crises, which were viewed as unsettling the Roman Republic and contributing to the Roman Republic's collapse. Tiberius Gracchus passed legislation which established a commission to survey Roman public land, assert state claims to it, and redistribute Roman public land to poor rural families. These reforms were a reaction to a perceived decline in Italy's rural population. A decade later, Gaius Gracchus reforms, among other things, attempted to buttress Tiberius's land commission and start Roman colonization outside of Italy. The Gracchi brothers were also far more broad. The Gracchi brothers also were far more broad, touching on many topics such as assignment of provincial commands, composition of juries for the permanent courts, and letting of state tax farming contracts. Both brothers were killed during or shortly after the conclusion of their respective tribunician terms. More recent scholarship on the Roman economy has viewed the Gracchi agrarian reforms as less impactful than claimed in the ancient sources. It is also clear that the vast majority of the Gracchi brothers' reformist legislation was left intact rather than repealed. Submodern scholars have also connect the agrarian reforms to degrading Rome's relations with Rome's Italian allies and the social war, as the reforms were a reassertion of Roman claims on public land that had been for decades largely occupied without title by Rome's Italian allies. Gracchian claims of Italian rural depopulation also were contradicted by archaeological evidence. The impact of the violent reaction to the two brothers, however, is of substantial import. It set a dangerous precedent that violence was an acceptable tool against political enemies. The Gracchi exerted a substantial influence on later politics. They were viewed alternately as popular martyrs or dangerous demagogues through the late Republic. The Gracchi brothers were also portrayed as social revolutionaries and proto-socialists during the French Revolution and afterwards. In that vein, the Gracchi brothers motivated social revolutionaries such as François Noël, Gracchus Babeuf, and opposition to enclosure in Britain, scholars today view these socialist comparisons as unapt. End footnote. Kropotkin did not write nonsense when he pointed to the free cities of Europe, marked not by the existence of states but by their absence. Indeed, let us also acknowledge that the state itself underwent a process of development and differentiation. At times developing no further than into a loose, almost minimal system of coercion, extending further at other times into an ever-growing apparatus. Finally, in this century, in particular, acquiring totalitarian control over every aspect of human existence, an apparatus that was only too familiar thousands of years ago, in Asia and even in Indian America in pre-Columbian times. The classical Athenian city-state was only partially statist. The classical Athenian city-state constituted a fraternity, often riven by class conflicts, of select citizens who collectively oppressed slaves, women, and even foreign students. The medieval state was often a much looser state formation than, say, the Roman imperial state, and at various times in history, one thinks of the comuneros in Spain during the 16th century and the sections in France during the 18th. The state almost completely collapsed, and direct democracies based on what approximated communalist political principles played a hegemonic role in social affairs. Wikipedia says, the revolt of the comuneros, or the War of Communities of Castile, was an uprising by citizens of Castile against the rule of Charles I and his administration between 1520 and 1521. At its height, the rebels controlled the heart of Castile, ruling the cities of Valladolid, Tordesillas, and Toledo. The revolt occurred in the wake of political instability in the crown of Castile after the death of Queen Isabella I in 1504. Isabella's daughter, Joanna, succeeded to the throne. Due to Joanna's mental instability, Castile was ruled by the nobles and her father, King Ferdinand I of Aragon, as a regent, while Joanna was confined. After Ferdinand's death in 1516, Joanna's 16-year-old son Charles was proclaimed Joanna's co-monarch of both Castile and Aragon, while Joanna was succeeded as Queen of Aragon. During her co-regency with her own son, she remained confined. Charles had been raised in the Netherlands with little knowledge of Castilian. Charles arrived in Spain in October 1517, accompanied by a large retinue of Flemish nobles and clerics. These factors resulted in mistrust between the new king, Charles, and the Castilian social elites, who could see the threat to their power and status. In 1519, Charles was elected Holy Roman Emperor. Charles departed for Germany in 1520, leaving the Dutch Cardinal Adrian Utrecht to rule Castile in his absence. Soon, a series of anti-government riots broke out in the cities, and local city councils, comunidades, took power. The rebels chose Charles's own mother, Queen Joanna, as an alternative ruler, hoping that they could control her madness. The rebel movement took place on a radical anti-feudal dimension, supporting peasant rebellions against the landed nobility. On the 23rd of April 1521, after nearly a year of rebellion, the reorganized supporters of the emperor struck a crippling blow to the comuneros at the Battle of Villar, I don't know. The following day, rebel leaders Juan López de Padilla, Juan Bravo, and Francisco Maldonado were beheaded. The army of the comuneros fell apart. Only the city of Toledo kept alive the rebellion led by Maria Pacheco until its surrender in October 1521. The character of the revolution is a matter of historiographical debate. According to some scholars, the revolt of comuneros was one of the first modern revolutions, notably because of the anti-noble sentiment against social injustice and the revolt of the Comuneros' basis on ideals of democracy and freedom. Others consider the revolt of the Comuneros a more typical rebellion against high taxes and perceived foreign control. From the 19th century onwards, the revolt of the Comuneros has been mythologized by various Spaniards, generally liberals who drew political inspiration from the revolt of the Comuneros. Conservative intellectuals have traditionally adopted more pro-imperial stances towards the revolt and have been critical of both the motives and government of the Comuneros. With the end of Franco's dictatorship and the establishment of the autonomous community of Castile and Leon, positive commemoration of the Comunidades has grown. On the 23rd of April, it now celebrated is now celebrated as Castile and Leon Day, and the incident is often referred to in Castilian nationalism. Back to the text. Libertarian municipalism is concerned with this political sphere, including aspects of basic civil importance, such as economic issues, as well as the many cultural factors that must play a role in the formation of true citizens, indeed, of rounded human beings. In this respect, it does not draw strict impenetrable barriers between politics and economics to the point where politics and economics are implacably set against each other. Libertarian municipalism calls for the municipalization of the economy, and, where material interests between communities overlap, the confederalization of the economy. In a very different sense, the libertarian municipalist arena may be a school for educating its youth and its mature citizens, but in a very fundamental sense, the libertarian municipalist arena may be a school for educating its youth and its mature citizens, but what makes it particularly significant, especially at this time, is that it is a sphere of power relations that must be crystallized against capitalism, the marketplace, the forces for ecological destruction, and the state. Indeed, without a movement that keeps this need completely in mind, libertarian municipalism may easily degenerate in this age of academic cretinism into another subject in a classroom curriculum. Libertarian municipalism's politics today on the historically preemptive role of the city in relation to the state, and above all, on the fact that civic institutions still exist, however distorted those civic institutions may appear, or however captive to the state these civic institutions may be, institutions that can be enlarged, radicalized, and eventually aimed at the elimination of the state. The city council, however feeble the city council's powers may be, still exists as the remnant of the communes with which the city council was identified in the past, especially in the Great French Revolution and the Paris Commune of 1871. The possibility of recreating a sectional democracy still remains, assuming either a legal or extra-legal form. We must bear in mind that the French revolutionary sections did not have any prior tradition on which to rest their claims to legitimacy. Indeed, they even emerged from the elitist assemblies or districts of 1789, which the monarchy had created to elect the Parisian deputies to the Estates General, except that they had refused to disband after they completed their electoral role and remained as watchdogs over the behavior of the estates in Versailles. We, too, are faced with the task of restructuring and expanding the civic democratic institutions that still exist, however vestigial these civic democratic institutions' forms and powers may be, of attempting to base these civic democratic institutions on old or new popular assemblies, and to be quite categorical of creating new legal, or most emphatically, extra-legal popular democratic institutions where vestiges of civic democracy do not exist. In doing so, we are direly in need of a movement, indeed, a responsible, well-structured, and programmatically coherent organization that can provide the educational resources, means of mobilization, and vital ideas for achieving our libertarian, communist, and municipalist goals. Our program should be flexible in the special sense that our program pose minimum demands that we seek to achieve at once, given the political sophistication of the community in which we function. But such demands would easily degenerate into reformism and even possibilism if these demands did not escalate into a body of transitional demands that ultimately lead to our maximum demands for a libertarian and ecological society. The concept of transitional demands is very important in Trotskyism. Nor can we give up our seemingly utopian vision that the great metropolitan areas can be structurally decentralized. Cities on the scale of New York, London, and Paris, not to speak of Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Bombay, and the like, must ultimately be parceled into smaller cities and decentralized to a point where they are once again humanly scaled communities, not huge and incomprehensible urban belts. Libertarian municipalism takes libertarian municipalism's immediate point of departure from the existing facts of urban life, many of which are beyond the comprehension of urban life's its residents. I guess that's it being the city's residents. But libertarian municipalism always strives to physically as well as politically fragment the great cities until libertarian municipalism achieves the great anarchist, communist, and even Marxian goal of scaling all cities to human dimensions. New section: Criticisms of Assembly Democracy. Perhaps the most common criticism that both Marxists and anarchists have presented against libertarian municipalism is the claim that modern cities are too huge to be organized around workable popular assemblies. Some critics assume that if we were to have true democracy, everyone from age 0 to 100, irrespective of health, mental condition, or disposition, must be included in a popular assembly, and that an assembly must be as small as a touchy-feely American encounter group, say 30 or 40 people, or, quote, affinity groups, unquote, as one critic calls it. But in large world cities, these critics suggest, which have several million residents, we would require many thousands of assemblies in order to achieve true democracy. In such cities, such a multiplicity of small assemblies, they argue, would be just too cumbersome and unworkable. But a large urban population is itself no obstacle to libertarian municipalism. Indeed, based on this kind of calculation, which would count all residents as participating citizens, the 48 Parisian sections of 1793 would have been completely dysfunctional. In view of the fact that revolutionary Paris had a total of 500,000 to 600,000 people, if every man, woman, and child, indeed every pathological lunatic and totally dysfunctional person had attended sectional assemblies, and each assembly had no more than 40 people, my arithmetic tells me that about 15,000 assemblies would have been needed to accommodate all the people of revolutionary Paris. Under such circumstances, one wonders how the French Revolution could ever have occurred. Such critics are usually not revolutionaries at all, and would probably believe that history would have been all the better if the sections had never existed to push the French Revolution forward. Their objection represents the instrumental mind qua calculating machine at its worst. A popular democracy, to begin with, is not premised on the idea that everyone can, will, or even wants to attend popular assemblies, nor should anyone make participation compulsory, coercing everyone into doing so. Even more significantly, it has rarely happened, indeed to my knowledge it has never happened in revolutionary history, that the great majority of people in a particular place, still less everyone, engage in revolution. In the face of insurrection in a revolutionary situation, while unknown militants aided by a fairly small number of supporters rise up and overthrow the established order, most people tend to be either active or inactive observers. Having viewed carefully the course of almost every major revolution in the Euro-American world, I can say with some knowledge that, even in a completely successful revolution, it was always a minority of the people who attended meetings of assemblies that made significant decisions about the fate of their society. The very differentiated political and social consciousness, interest, education, and backgrounds among masses in a capitalist society guarantee that people will be drawn into revolutions in waves, if at all. The foremost, most militant wave is, at first, numerically surprisingly small. It is followed by seeming bystanders who, if an uprising seems to be capable of success, merge with the foremost wave, and only after the uprising is likely to be successful do the politically less developed waves, in varying degrees, follow it. Even after an uprising is successful, it takes time for a substantial majority of the people to fully participate in the revolutionary process, commonly as crowds in demonstrations, more rarely as participants in revolutionary institutions. In the English Revolution of the 1640s, for example, it was primarily the Puritan army that raised the most democratic issues, with the support of the Levelers, who formed a very small fraction of the civilian population. The American Revolution was notoriously supported, albeit by no means actively, by 1/3 of the colonial population. The Great French Revolution found its principal support in Paris, and was carried forward by 48 sections, most of which were rooted in assemblies that were poorly attended, except at times when momentous decisions around the most revolutionary neighborhoods. When the momentous decisions aroused the most revolutionary neighborhoods. Indeed, what decided the fate of most revolutions was less the amount of support those revolutions' militants received than the degree of resistance they encountered. What brought Louis XVI and Louis XVI's family back to Paris from Versailles in October 1789 was certainly not all the women of Paris. Indeed, only a few thousand made the famous march to Versailles, but the king's own inability to mobilize a sufficiently large and reliable force to resist them. The Russian Revolution of February 1917 in Petrograd, for many historians the quote model of a mass spontaneous revolution, and an uprising far more nuanced than most accounts suggest, succeeded because not even the Tsar's personal guard, let alone such formerly reliable supports of the autocracy as the Cossacks, was prepared to defend the monarchy. Indeed, in revolutionary Barcelona in 1936, the resistance to Franco's forces were initiated by only a few thousand anarcho-syndicalists with the aid of the assault guards, whose discipline, weaponry, and training were indispensable factors in pinning down and ultimately defeating the regular army's uprising. It is such constellations of forces, in fact, that explain how revolutions actually succeed. They do not triumph because, quote, everyone, or even a majority of the population, actively participates in overthrowing an oppressive regime, but because the armed forces of the old order and the population at large are no longer willing to defend the old order against a militant and resolute minority. Nor is it likely, however desirable it may be, that after a successful insurrection the great majority of the people or even the oppressed will personally participate in revolutionizing society. Following the success of a revolution, the majority of people tend to withdraw into the localities in which those people live, however large or small, where the problems of everyday life have their most visible impact on the masses. These localities may be residential and or occupational neighborhoods in large cities, the environs of villages and hamlets, or even at some distance from the center of a city or region, fairly dispersed localities in which people live and work. In short, I fail to see why the large size of modern cities should constitute an insuperable obstacle to the formation of a neighborhood assembly movement. The doors of the neighborhood assembly should always be open to whoever lives in the neighborhood. Politically less aware individuals may choose not to attend their neighborhood assembly, and they should not be obliged to attend. The assemblies, regardless of their size, will have problems enough, without having to deal with indifferent bystanders and passers-by. What counts is that the doors of the assemblies remain open for all who wish to attend and participate, for therein lies the true democratic nature of neighborhood assemblies. Another criticism I have heard against Libertarian Municipalism is that a forceful speaker or faction may manipulate a large crowd, such as numerous citizens at an assembly meeting. This Philistine criticism could be directed against any democratic institution, be it a large assembly, a small committee, an ad hoc conference or meeting, or even a, quote, affinity group. In my view, Such a transparent effort to inflict bruises on any attempt to create a popular organization hardly deserves discussion. The size of the group is not a factor here. Some very abusive tyrannies appear in very small groups, where one or two intimidating figures can completely dominate everyone else. What the critics might well ask, but seldom do, is how are we to prevent persuasive individuals from making demagogic attempts to control any popular assembly, regardless of size? In my view, the only obstacle to such attempts is the existence of an organized body of revolutionaries, yes, even a faction, that is committed to seeking truth, exercising rationality, and advancing an ethics of public responsibility. Such a faction or organization will be needed, in my view, not only before and during a revolution, but also after a revolution, when the constructive problem of creating stable, enduring, and educational democratic institutions becomes the order of the day. Such an organization will be particularly needed during the period of social reconstruction, when attempts are made to put libertarian municipalism into practice. We cannot expect that, just because we propose the establishment of neighborhood assemblies, we will always, or perhaps even often, be the majority in the very institutions that we have significantly helped to establish. We must always be prepared, in fact, to be in the minority, until such time as circumstances and social instability make our overall messages plausible to assembly majorities. New section: Class and Transclass Issues. Indeed, wherever we establish a popular assembly, with or without legal legitimacy, that popular assembly will eventually be invaded by competing class interests. Libertarian municipalism, I should emphasize here, is not an attempt to overlook or evade the reality of class conflict. On the contrary, libertarian municipalism attempts, among other things, to give due recognition to the class struggle's civic dimension. Modern conflict between classes have never been confined simply to the factory or workplace. They have also taken a distinctly urban form, as in, quote, revolutionary Paris, quote, red Petrograd, and, quote, anarcho-syndicalist Barcelona. Any study of these great revolutions vividly reveals the battle between classes has always been a battle not only between different economic strata in society, but also within and between neighborhoods. Moreover, the neighborhood, town, and village also generates searing issues that cut across class lines. Between working people, the traditional industrial proletariat, which is now dwindling in numbers in Europe and the United States and is fighting a rearguard battle with capital, middle-class strata, which lack any consciousness of themselves as working people, the vast army of government employees, a huge professional and technical stratum that is not likely to regard that stratum self as proletariat, and an underclass that is essentially demoralized and helpless. We cannot ignore the compelling fact that capitalism has changed since the end of World War II, that capitalism has transformed the very social fiber of the great majority of people, both attitudinally and occupationally, in Western Europe and the United States, that it will wreak even further changes in the decades that lie ahead, with dazzling rapidity, especially as automation is further developed as new resources, techniques, and products replace those that seem so dominant today. No revolutionary movement can ignore the problems that capitalism is likely to generate in the years that lie ahead, especially in terms of capital's profound effects on both society and the environment. The futility of syndicalism today lies in the fact that syndicalism is still trying to address the problems generated by the old Industrial Revolution, and in the context of the social setting that gave these problems meaning in the first half of the 20th century. If we have historically exhausted the syndicalist alternative, it is because the industrial proletariat is everywhere destined, by virtue of technological innovation, to become a small minority of the population. It will not do to try to theoretically fabricate a, quote, proletariat out of clerical service and professional, quote, workers, who in many, if not most cases, will not acquire the class consciousness that identified and gave a historical standing to the authentic proletarian. By these strata, often among the most exploited and oppressed, these strata, often among the most exploited and oppressed, can be enlisted to support our communalist ideals on the basis of the larger environment in which they live and the larger issues of their sovereignty in a world that is racing out of control, namely their neighborhoods, cities, and towns, and the expansion of their democratic rights as free citizens in a world that has reduced them to mere electoral constituents. They can be mobilized to support our communalist ideals because they feel their power to control their own lives is diminishing in the face of centralized state and corporate power. Needless to say, I am not denying that working people have grim economic problems that may pit those working people against capital, but their quasi-middle class outlook, if not status, diminishes their ability to see the ills of capitalism exclusively as an economic system. Today we live in an era of permanent industrial revolution, in which people tend to respond to the extreme rapidity and vast scope of change with a mysticism that expresses people's disempowerment and a privatism that expresses their inability to contend with change. Indeed, capitalism, far from being, quote, advanced, still less, quote, moribund, continues to mature and extend its scope. What it will look like half a century or a century from now is open to the boldest of speculations. Hence, more than ever, any revolutionary left libertarian movement must, in my view, recognize the importance of the municipality as the locus of new, indeed often trans-class problems that cannot simply be reduced to the struggle between wage labor and capital. Real problems of environmental deterioration affect everyone in a community. Real problems of social and economic inequalities affect everyone in a community. Real problems of health, education, sanitary conditions, and the nightmare, as Paul Goodman put it, of, quote, growing up absurd, and, quote, plague everyone in a community. Problems that are even more serious today than they were in the alienated 1960s decade. According to Wikipedia, Growing Up Absurd is a 1960 book by Paul Goodman on the relationship between American juvenile delinquency and societal opportunities to fulfill natural needs. Contrary to the then popular view that juvenile delinquents should be led to respect societal norms, Paul Goodman argued that young American men were justified in their disaffection because their society lacked the preconditions for growing up, such as meaningful work, honorable community, sexual freedom, and spiritual sustenance. Paul Goodman's book drew from his prior works, psychotherapy practice, and personal experience in relations in New York City. The small New York press that originally commissioned the book asked Paul Goodman to return his advance when the resulting book, written in late 1959, focused less on the commission's subject of city youth gangs than on the American culture and value system in which the youth were raised. 19 publishers rejected Growing Up Absurd before Norman Podhoretz used selections from the book to relaunch his magazine, Commentary. After Podhoretz encouraged Random House publisher Jason Epstein to reconsider Growing Up Absurd, Paul Goodman had a contract the next day. Random House published Growing Up Absurd in 1960, and a Vintage Books paperback edition followed 2 years later. Growing Up Absurd became a bestseller with 100,000 copies sold in Growing Up Absurd's first 3 years and translated into 5 languages. Growing Up Absurd was widely read across 1960s college campuses and popular among student activists in the New Left who assimilated the author's ideology. Growing Up Absurd transformed Paul Goodman's outcast career into mainstream notoriety as a social critic, including invitations to lecture at hundreds of colleges, though Goodman's fame did not endure long after his death in 1972. Many specifics of Growing Up Absurd became dated with time, and in later years, retrospective reviewers criticized Goodman's exclusion of women from his analysis. New York Review of Books reissued Growing Up Absurd in 2012. So that was for Growing Up Absurd. Paul Goodman lived from 1911 to 1972. Paul Goodman was an American writer and public intellectual, best known for Paul Goodman's 1960s works of social criticism. Paul Goodman was prolific across numerous literary genres and nonfiction topics, including the arts, civil rights, decentralization, democracy, education, media, politics, psychology, technology, urban planning, and war. As a humanist and self-styled man of letters, Paul Goodman's works often addressed a common theme of the individual citizen's duties in the larger society and the responsibility to exercise autonomy, act creatively, and realize one's own human nature. Born to a Jewish family in New York City, Paul Goodman was raised by Paul Goodman's aunts and sisters and attended City College of New York. As an aspiring writer, Paul Goodman wrote and published poems and fiction before receiving his doctorate from the University of Chicago. Paul Goodman returned to writing in New York City and took sporadic magazine writings and teaching jobs, several of which he lost for his overt bisexuality and World War II draft resistance. Paul Goodman discovered anarchism and wrote for libertarian journals. Paul Goodman's radicalism was rooted in psychological theory. Paul Goodman co-wrote the theory behind Gestalt therapy based on Wilhelm Reich's radical Freudianism and held psychoanalytic sessions through the 1950s while continuing to write prolifically. Paul Goodman's 1960 book of social criticism, Growing Up Absurd, established Paul Goodman's importance as a mainstream anti-establishment cultural theorist. Paul Goodman became known as the, quote, philosopher of the New Left, end quote, and Paul Goodman's anarchistic disposition was influential in 1960s counterculture and the free school movement. Despite being the foremost American intellectual of non-Marxist radicalism in his time, Paul Goodman's celebrity did not endure far beyond his life. Paul Goodman is remembered for his utopian proposals and principled belief in human potential. Back to the text. These transclass issues can bring people together with workers of all kinds in a common effort to see their self-empowerment, an issue that cannot be resolved in the conflict of wage labor against capital alone. Nor are workers mere, quote, agents of history, as vulgar Marxists and implicitly syndicalists would have us believe. Workers live in cities, towns, and villages, not only as class beings, but also as civic beings. Workers are fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, friends and comrades, and no less than their ecological counterparts among the petty bourgeoisie. They are concerned with environmental issues. As parents and young people, workers are concerned with the problems of acquiring an education, entering a profession, and the like. Workers are deeply disturbed by the decay of urban infrastructures, the diminution of inexpensive housing, and the issue of urban safety and aesthetics. Workers' horizon extends far beyond the realm of the factory or even the office to the residential urban world in which workers and their families live. After I had spent years working in factories, I was not surprised to find that I could reach workers, middle-class people, and even relatively affluent individuals more easily by discussing issues related to their lived environments, their neighborhoods and cities, rather than to their workplaces. Today, in particular, the globalization of capital raises the question of how localities can keep productive resources within their own confines without impairing the opportunities of people in the so-called, quote, third world or South to freely develop technologically according to their own needs. This conundrum cannot be resolved by legislation and economic reforms. Capitalism is a compulsively expansive system. One second, sorry. A modern market economy dictates that an enterprise must grow or die, and nothing will prevent capitalism from industrializing, more accurately, expanding endlessly over the entire face of the planet whenever capitalism is prepared to do so. Only the complete reconstruction of society and the economy can end the dilemmas that globalization raises, including the one-sided economic development of the South, often at the expense of workers in the North, and the enhancement of corporate power to the point of threatening the stability, indeed the very safety, of the planet. Here again, I would contend that only a grassroots economic policy based on a libertarian municipalist agenda and movement can offer a major alternative, and is precisely an alternative that many people seek today, capable of arresting the impact of globalization. For the problem of globalization, there is no global solution. Global capital, precisely because of global capital's very hugeness, can only be eaten away at global capital's roots, specifically by means of a libertarian municipalist resistance at the base of society. It must be eroded by the myriad millions who, mobilized by a grassroots movement, challenge global capital's sovereignty over their lives and try to develop local and regional economic alternatives to its industrial operations. Developing this resistance would involve subsidizing municipally controlled industries and retail outlets, and taking recourse to regional resources the capital does not find it profitable to use. A municipalized economy, slow as it may be in the making, will be a moral economy, one that concerned primarily with the quality of its products and their production at the lowest possible cost, can hope to ultimately subvert a corporate economy, whose success is measured entirely by that corporate economy's profits rather than by the quality of its commodities. Let me stress that when I speak of a moral economy, I'm not advocating a communitarian or cooperative economy in which small profiteers, however well-meaning their intentions may be, simply become little, quote, self-managed, end quote, capitalists in their own right. In my own community, I have seen a self-styled, quote, moral enterprise, end quote, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, grow in typical capitalist fashion from a small, presumably, quote, caring and intimate enterprise into a global corporation, intent on making profit and fostering the myth that, quote, capitalism can be good, end quote. Cooperatives that profess to be moral in their intentions have yet to make any headway in replacing big capitalist concerns, or even in surviving without themselves becoming capitalistic in their methods and profit-oriented in their goals. The predominant myth that small associations of producers, as opposed to genuinely socialistic or libertarian communistic endeavor, can slowly eat away at capitalism should finally be dispelled. Sadly, these generally failed illusions are still promoted by liberals such as Harry Boyd and by naive lifestyle anarchists such as, God damn it, I hate Google Lens, such as, gotta scroll back to the top, journalistic ruffians at Anarchy, a journal of desire armed, and pure academics such as John Clark and his associates. Can't really find anything for Harry Boyd. Anarchy was an anarchist monthly magazine shit. Yeah, I can't really find anything on Anarchy, a journal of desire armed. I mean, I know what it is. It's just an anarchist magazine. I think it had a lot of like post-left stuff, but I'm not sure. John Clark, I think it's usually John P. Clark is how it is. Uh, John Philip Clarke, I'm assuming this is who's being talked about here. John Philip Clarke, 1945, known professionally as John P. Clarke, is an American philosopher, academician, dialectician, author, environmental activist, social theorist, and anarchist. He's professor emeritus of philosophy at Loyola University, New Orleans, where he was the Gregory F. Curtin Distinguished Professor in Humane Letters and the Professions. John Philip Clarke is currently director of Libertarian Institute for Ecology and Community in Dedeaux, is that Mississippi? The author and editor of several books and numerous articles, he is also known to write under the pen name Max Caffard. Oh, it actually says here, though splitting ideologically from Bookchin's social ecology in the mid-1990s, Clarke began differentiating his approach in 1999 with his essay, The Politics of Social Ecology, Beyond the Limits of the City. He would further differentiate between Bookchin's social ecology and what Clarke calls dialectical social ecology with the publication of, quote, of a piece titled Domesticating the Dialectic, a critique of Bookchin's neo-Aristotelianism in 2008. Back to the text. Either municipalized enterprises controlled by citizens' assemblies will try to take over the economy, or capitalism will prevail in this sphere of life with a forcefulness that no mere rhetoric can diminish. Capitalist society has effects not only on economic and social relations, but on ideas and intellectual traditions as well. Indeed, on all of history, fragmenting them until knowledge, discourse, and even reality become blurred, divested of any distinctions, specificity, and articulation. The culture that promotes this celebration of diffuseness and fragmentation, a culture that is epidemic in American colleges and universities, goes under the name of post-structuralism, or more commonly postmodernism. Given its corrosive precepts, the postmodernist worldview is able to level or homogenize everything that is unique or distinctive, dissolving it into a low common denominator of ideas. Consider, for example, the obscurantist term Earth citizenship. Which dissolves the very complex notion of, quote, citizenship with its presuppositions of paideia, that is, the lifelong education of the citizen for the practice of civic self-management, into a diffuse category by extending and cheapening the notion of citizenship to include animals, plants, rocks, mountains, the planet, indeed the very cosmos itself. I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, but I think it's paideia. Paideia referred to the rearing and education of the ideal member of the ancient Greek polis or state. These educational ideals later spread to the Greco-Roman world at large and were later called humanitas in Latin. Paideia was meant to instill aristocratic virtues in the young citizen men who were trained in this way. An ideal man within the polis would be well-rounded, refined in intellect, morals, and physicality. So training of the body, mind, and soul was important. Both practical, subject-based schooling as well as focus upon the socialization of individuals within the aristocratic order of the polis were part of this training. The practical aspects of paideia included subjects within the modern designation of the liberal arts, e.g. rhetoric, grammar, and philosophy, as well as scientific disciplines like arithmetic and medicine. Gymnastics, wrestling were valued for their effect on the body, alongside the moral education which is imparted by the study of music, poetry, and philosophy. This approach to the rearing of a well-grounded Greek male was common to the Greek-speaking world, with the exception of Sparta, where agoge was practiced. Back to the text. With a purely metaphysical label for all relationships as a, quote, earth community, end quote, the historical and contemporary uniqueness of the city disappears. It presumably preempts every other community because of its wider scope and breadth. Such metaphors ultimately flatten everything, in effect, into a universal, quote, oneness that, in the name of, quote, ecological wisdom, end quote, denies definition to vital concepts and realities by the very ubiquity of the, quote, one. If the word, quote, citizen applies to every existing thing, and if the word, quote, community, end quote, embraces all relations in this seemingly, quote, green world, then nothing, in fact, is a citizen or a community. Just as the logical category, quote, being is rendered as mere existence, being can only be regarded as interchangeable with nothing. So, too, quote, citizen and, quote, community become a universal passport to vacuity, not to uniquely civic conditions that have been forming and differentiating dialectically for thousands of years through the ancient, medieval, and modern worlds. To reduce them to an abstract, quote, community is to ultimately negate their wealth of evolutionary forms and particularly their differentiation as sophisticated aspects of human freedom. New section, challenges for our movements. As a revolutionary politics, libertarian municipalism must nonetheless be perceived as a process, a patient practice that will probably have only limited success at the present time, and even then only in select areas that can at best provide examples of the possibilities it could hold if and when it is adopted on a large scale. We will not create a libertarian municipalist society overnight, and in this era of counter-revolution, we must be prepared to endure more failures than successes. Patience and commitment are traits that revolutionaries of the past cultivated assiduously. Alas, today, in our fast consumerist society, the demand for immediate gratification, for fast food and fast living, inculcates a demand for fast politics. Individuals are prone to adopt a fast lifestyle over one that acknowledges the need for slow growth. With all its disappointments, would do well to learn the art of throwing bricks and painting graffiti, rather than commit themselves to the educational responsibilities required by a libertarian municipalist movement. What should count for us is whether libertarian municipalism is a rational means for achieving the rational culmination of human development, whether it is suitable as a quick fix for present social problems. We must learn to be flexible without allowing our basic principles to be replaced by a postmodernist quagmire of ad hoc, ever-changeable opinions. For example, if we have no choice but to use electronic means, such as to establish popular participation in relatively large citizens' assemblies, then so be it. But we should, I would argue, do so only when it is unavoidable, and for only as long as is necessary. By the same token, if certain desirable measures require a degree of centralization, then we should accept that, without sacrificing, let me insist, the right to immediate recall. But here, too, we should endure such organizational measures for only as long as they are necessary and no longer. Our basic principles in such cases must always be our guide. We remain committed to direct face-to-face democracy and a well-coordinated confederal but decentralized society. Nor should we fetishize consensus over democracy in our decision-making processes. Consensus, as I have argued, is practicable with very small groups in which people know each other intimately. But in larger groups it becomes tyrannical because consensus allows a small minority to decide what will be the practice of a large or even sizable majority, and it fosters homogeneity and stagnation in ideas and policies. Minorities and their factions are the indispensable yeast for maturing new ideas, and nearly all new ideas start out as the views of minorities. In a libertarian group, the, quote, rule, end quote, of the majority of a minority is a myth. No one expects a minority to give up that minority's unpopular beliefs, or to yield to that minority's right, to argue that minority's views. But the minority must have patience and allow a majority decision to be put into practice. The experience and the discussion it generates should be the most decisive element in impelling a group or assembly to reconsider its decision and adopt the minority's viewpoint, spurring on the further innovation of practices and ideas as other minorities emerge. Consensus decision-making can easily produce intellectual and practical stagnation if it essentially compels a majority to forego a specific policy in order to please a minority. It will not enter here into my distinction between policy decisions and their enactment in practice by those qualified to administer them. I will only note something that my friend Gary Sisko has pointed out, that if the U.S. Congress, a gathering for the most part of lawyers, can make basic policy decisions on the reconstruction of the American infrastructure, on war and peace, on education and foreign policy, etc., without having full knowledge of all aspects of these fields, leaving the administration of their decisions to others, then it's difficult to understand why a citizens' assembly cannot make policy decisions on usually more modest issues and leave their administration under close supervision to experts in the fields involved. Among the other issues we must at some point consider are the place of law or nomos in a libertarian municipalist society, as well as constitutions that lay down important principles of right or justice and freedom. Are we to vest the perpetuation of our guiding principles simply in blind custom, or in the good nature of our fellow humans, which allows for a great deal of arbitrariness? For centuries, oppressed peoples demanded written founding constitutional provisions to protect them from arbitrary oppression by the nobility. With the emergence of a libertarian communist society, this problem does not disappear. For us, I believe, the question can never be whether law and constitutions are inherently, quote, authoritarian, but whether they are rational, mutable, secular, and restrictive only in the sense that they prohibit the abuse of power. Admittedly, the present time is not one that is favorable for the spread of revolutionary and libertarian anti-capitalist ideas and movements. Unless we are to let the capitalist cancer spread over the entire planet, however, absorbing even the natural world into the world economy, we must develop a theory and practice that provides us with an entry into the public sphere, a theory and practice, I should emphasize, that is consistent with the goal of a rational libertarian communist society. Finally, we must assert the historic right of speculative reason, resting on the real potentialities of human beings, as we know them from the past as well as the present, to project itself beyond the immediate environment in which we live. Indeed, to claim that the present irrational society is not the actual, or, quote, real, end quote, that is worthy of the human condition, despite its prevalence and, to many people, its permanence. The present society is untrue to the project of fulfilling humanity's potentiality for freedom and self-consciousness. Hence, the present society is unreal in the sense that the present society is a betrayal of the claims of humanity's greatest qualities, the capacity for reason and innovation. If our attempts to think, fight for, educate people about, and rise in battle for a libertarian communist society based on the commune of communes are evidence of, quote, Bookchinist will, end quote, for which the present-day mystics such as John Clark, aka Max Caffard, or C, have criticized me, then I can only reply that I find all the more flattering this association with Bookchin, who had denounced Clark's Taoist notions of passivity and, quote, going with the flow, end quote, as a fundamental accommodation to the status quo. Libertarian municipalists must distinguish themselves from those who, in the name of organic thought, reduce themselves to bystanders, their behavior guided by the Taoist doctrine of, quote, Wu Wei, that is, the, quote, virtues of non-action. I don't know if I'm saying this right. It might be Wu Wai. I'll say it's Wu Wai. Wu Wai is an ancient Chinese concept which has a polymorphic meaning that expresses, quote, inexertion, quote, inaction, or, quote, effortless action. Wu Wai emerged in the spring and autumn period, with early literary examples as an idea in the classic of poetry. Wu Wai becomes an important concept in the Confucian Analects, Chinese statecraft, and Taoism. Wu Wai is most commonly used to refer to an ideal form of government, including the behavior of the emperor, describing a state of personal harmony, free-flowing spontaneity, and laissez-faire. Wu Wai generally denotes a state of spirit that is a state of being that has a congruent connection between intention and action that was integrally connected to the Confucian ethics of practical morality. Wu Wai is the main principle of Taoist philosophy, which speaks of the importance of achieving the Tao, or the natural way, in all actions and development of things, without forcing or rushing against the natural order of things to avoid false development and mistakes. The philosophy of Tao, Dai Jia, the religion of Tao, Tao Jiao, are two different things. For example, in the philosophy of Tao, Tao Jia, there is no mysticism and belief in ghosts and evil spirits. Sinologist Jean-Francois Beater describes Wu Wai as a, quote, state of perfect knowledge, understanding of the coexistence of the situation and perceiver, perfect efficaciousness, and the realization of a perfect economy of energy, end quote. So that's Wu Wai. Back to the text. By the same token, that broad school of ideas we call, quote, anarchism is faced with a parting of the ways between those who genuinely wish to focus their efforts on the revolutionary elimination of hierarchical and class society, and self-indulgent lifestyle anarchists who, if they believe in anything beyond mere adventures, say throwing bricks at police, see social change only in terms of their personal self-expression and the replacement of serious ideas with mystical fantasies. Left libertarian revolutionaries cannot have any hopes of creating a public movement unless they formulate a politics that opens it to social intervention. Indeed, that is brought into the public sphere as an organized movement that can grow, think rationally, mobilize people, and actively seek to change the world. The Social Democrats have offered us parliamentary reforms as a practice, and the results they have produced have been debilitating, most notably a radical decline in public life and a disastrous growth in consumerist self-indulgence and privatism. Although the Stalinists as architects of the totalitarian state have mostly passed from the public scene, a few persist as parasites in whatever radical movement may emerge among oppressed peoples, and fascism, in fascism's various mutations, has attempted to fill the void created by disempowerment and a lack of human scale in politics as well as community, with tragic results. As left libertarians, we must ask ourselves what mode of entry into the public sphere is consistent with our vision of empowerment. If our ideal is the commune of communes, then I submit that the only means of entry and social fulfillment is a politics that is a movement and program that finally emerges on the local electoral scene as the uncompromising advocate of popular neighborhood and town assemblies and the development of a municipalized economy. I know of no other alternative to capitulation to the existing society, unless some among us wish to throw rocks at police, deface walls with graffiti, or engage in ad hoc, quote, actions that disappear without any trace like a pebble thrown into a lake. I have no doubt that Libertarian Municipalism, if Libertarian Municipalism meets with a measure of success, will face many obstacles and the possibility of being co-opted or degenerated. That it will face not only a civic realm of ideological discord, but internal discord within its own organizational framework. And that Libertarian Municipalism opens a broad field of political conflict with all its risks and uncertainties. At a time when social life has been trivialized beyond description, when accommodation to capitalist values and life ways has reached unprecedented levels, when anarchism and socialism are seen as the, quote, lost causes of 19th and early 20th centuries, one can only hope that such discord becomes a genuine public reality. At no time has mediocrity been more triumphant than it is today, and at no time has indifference to social and political issues been as widespread. I do not believe that the social change can be achieved without taking risks, allowing for uncertainties, and recognizing the possibility of failure. If we're to have any effect on the fossilization of public life, to the extent that the present period is marked in any sense by a genuine public life, history too must move with us. On this score, I am much too old to make worthwhile predictions about how the course of events will unfold, except to say that the present, whether for good or ill, will hardly be recognizable to the generation that will come of age 50 years from now, so rapidly things are likely to change in the present century. But where change exists, so too do possibilities. The times cannot remain as the times are, any more than the world can be frozen into immobility. What we can hope to do is to preserve the thread of rationality that distinguishes true civilization from barbarism, and barbarism would indeed be the outcome of a world that is permitted to tumble into a future without rational activity or guidance. For those who will a world of freedom and self-consciousness, there can be no accommodation with the status quo. The end. Thank you for listening.